Okay, it's great to be back in our series called The Weave, where we want to look back to move forward. This is a collaboration between the University of Hawaii, Sustainable Community Food Systems, and Pacific Farmer Organizations through the HIA project. And today we're joined by Dr. Lex Thompson, who's a longtime agroforestry researcher and practitioner, and he's worked alongside farmers, communities, and governments across the Pacific for many decades. His work spans tree crops, forest products, and sustainable livelihoods, and a special experience in Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu, nearly 40 years. And really bringing today both Pacific and regional perspectives. Lex wants to hopefully offer us kind of a grounded view on what traditional agroforestry systems used to look like, how they have evolved, and very importantly, what it means to kind of look back in order to move forward. So Lex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a real pleasure to be here and be part of this very important series. I'd just like to also mention that I'm an associate professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast. So I just wanted to put that in, but yeah. Great.
Yeah, and so Lex, you and I have known each other for quite a long time, and I'm always fascinated by the tramping around that you do in the forests of the Pacific. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about one of your big hobbies, and the photo we saw you about was you holding a hibiscus flower.
Yeah, well, that started by accident. I was in Banao Levu, and we were sampling DNA of Xanthan Yassi or sandalwood, and the boat didn't show up. So I didn't want to waste that afternoon. So we together with a couple of foresters, we drove up the top of Mount Delacoro, and lo and behold, here was this new species of hibiscus greeting us. So that then kicked off another hobby that they seem to have been neglected, because the original hibiscus were sort of discovered in discovered by Europeans in the 1850s, and they got to Europe, and then the botanists there were completely confused by what was a hybrid or what was a species. And so I've been unraveling that, and I think in Fiji we've got about 5 species. We've discovered a new one in Vanuatu and a new one in Tahiti. And what's interesting is that most people know the Hibiscus rosa sinensis, but they think that it was brought by Polynesians into the Pacific from Southeast Asia. In actual fact, it went the other way. Polynesians collected the one from Tahiti, took it to the Polynesian outlier islands, northern Vanuatu, and there they had it together in a garden with this other hibiscus cooperi, and they made, by accident, or that they made that new species. But people are only now realizing that Hibiscus rosa sinensis is a true South Pacific species, hybrid. Yeah.
So. Oh, that's cool, Lex. And that's not the only kind of plant mystery you've been uncovering. I read one of your recent papers together with some researchers from Vanuatu about the origins and kind of the center of diversity for breadfruit. So tell me a little bit about your fascination with kind of these historical centers of origin and movement of plants, and why is that important as we kind of think about our work today?
Well, I think my background is more in forest genetics, which is looking at the diversity in tree species and how to best use that and make use of that diversity, which is particularly important now. We're having climate change and all sorts of other impacts. The work when I started to work on the hibiscus, I realized that this story wasn't correct about how plants were moving in the Pacific. And the traditional wisdom was that breadfruit, Artocarpus altus, was a domesticate of this Artocarpus camansi, a species from Papua New Guinea and the Philippines. But when you looked into it further, and with the new DNA evidence coming out, it was clear that it was actually a native species of that area in northern Vanuatu and Tuamotu province in the southern Solomon Islands. So this is really important because it's probably the Pacific's only really major food species, but it's a native from northern Vanuatu. Well, probably actually from Tuamotu, those big volcanic islands in that province. And it's important, if you want to do research and improve breadfruit, it's important to know where it originated from, the center of diversity. For example, there's a breadfruit there that has a purple flesh, which is really rich in anthocyanins, which is really important for nutrition. So it would be really good for that breadfruit to make its way out of, escape from those Santa Cruz and, be a benefit to people elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. No, it's great. I enjoyed reading that paper, and I love this kind of discovery process that you're on. But coming back to this topic of agroforestry, and it's great to have you a part of this series to be able to talk a little bit about agroforestry. And can you tell us kind of about the Pacific as a whole? I know it's quite generalized, but from your experience, what did traditional agroforestry look like prior to contact or outside influence in the Pacific?
Yeah, it's a bit hard to know because it's not that well documented. So you may have to look at some communities where there hasn't been that much change. And I'll give an example of Western Province in Papua New Guinea. And I was traveling there to work with the PNG Department of Forest and CSIRO, collecting seed of tropical acacias, which are really important for reforestation and producing timber and paper pulp. Now, I met an old PNG lady there, and I was looking with her. We were looking at this forest, I thought, this is the most beautiful, pristine rainforest I've seen in the Pacific. It had a multitude of different species, very large trees, about a meter, some of them a meter in diameter. And she said to me, this was my garden place when I was a kid. So you realize that it was completely cleared. It was ground zero. It was cleared for cropping, and that the involvement of the tree species to get back to restore the soil fertility, to restore the organic matter, the nitrogen, it was very important. So the acacias that we were collecting there's about 5 species. They are very important as a sort of a stepping stone to getting back to improving the soil and getting back to a native forest, or restoring it so you can do better cropping. So one of them, those species I want to mention, is Acacia mangium, and it grows in Papua New Guinea and Northern Australia, and it was introduced by the Department of Forestry into Fiji. And now over on your island of Vanuatu, there's some Fijians complaining this tree is spreading. But what they don't realize is that this is the most beneficial tree in terms of improving soil fertility that you can ever imagine. It can grow at about 7 meters per year, and it can transform what you might have like a horrible orange clay. It can transform that with having about 6 inches or 12 inches of worm cast in just a few years, and you got this beautiful black organic loam. So the Fijians that we were working with on BT level, they realized the benefit of these trees. They had swampy areas around Naylor and those places that they couldn't use for cropping, but after they grew the acacias there, the acacias dried out the soil, increased the organic matter, and that's where they get their best yields of darlo and other root crops. So that was an example from PNG where they had the first trees that would invade there on this ground zero after the cropping were the acacias, and they restored the fertility, and then you got back a whole range of other species. Traditional agroforestry systems, like imagine in places like Fiji, it was a matter of they'd go and they would clear an area in the bush, and then they would grow their root crops there, or these days it's often kava that they're growing, and then they would leave that area and they'd go and find another area the next year. So it's not a very intensive system or productive system, and it relies on having a low population density. You can't do that if you've got a very high population level. So then you can look at probably some areas like in Tuamotu in Solomon Islands, which I haven't visited, but I've read a lot about. But they had more organized systems where they would select particular varieties for example, of Terminale Catapa, what we call Tavola or Tali in Samoa. They would select varieties that they had really good quality nuts. And they might select the Ndawa, the Hamisha pinnata, that's got Pacific lychee is another name. They would select varieties that are dwarf varieties that have very large fruits that they could use. So, and likewise with breadfruit, they selected a lot of varieties of breadfruit. Canarium nuts. Like, I mean, people think that the cradle of civilization is Mesopotamia, but probably a similar, 3,000 years ago, people in the Pacific or longer were domesticating canarium and other varieties of nuts that they were using in part of the system. The other thing that people like Randy Thaman, who studied for his PhD, studied agroforestry in Tonga, he said that when people go into an area and clear it, they will protect certain species that are most valued to them, that have some other, they might have a cultural value, they might have a use for traditional medicine, they might be important fuelwoods later, but they will protect them. And a good example of that is the nakoka, the Bischoffia javanica. The people in Tonga and also Fiji have recognized that that tree is very good at cycling up nutrients from depth and improving the soil fertility. So that's another example. I think on the atolls it's different again, but once again you've got people have selected particular varieties that are good. For example, in Kiribati and Marshall Islands, Micronesia, they've selected varieties of pandanus that have low oxalate levels. So these are really, and you have people, certain islands, they call it, they're the pandanus people, and the pandanus is nearly the main fruit. So normally, if you had a pandanus in Fiji, if you tried to eat the fruit of it, there's separate male and female plants. But if you tried to eat the fruit of it, it would leave not a very pleasant taste in your mouth. But they've managed to, in places like Kiribati, maybe select more than 100 named varieties of pandanus, which they grow through branch cuttings. So that's important. The other thing with pandanus, as an example, we talk about the weave. Pandanus is really important for weaving. It's like on the island of Ha'apai, they get more than half of their income from pandanus handicrafts. So pandanus is really an important tree. I was going to say something else about pandanus, but yeah, it's such a multi-purpose tree. Oh yes, what I was going to say is that if you up around the equator, the rainfall can vary tremendously from year to year, and in very dry years, coconuts stop fruiting, but the pandanus keeps fruiting. So with climate change happening and more extreme climates, the pandanus is a really important species to cope with drought. Yeah.
That's really interesting, Lex. Kind of hearing about the selection process, the domestication, how trees were used as part of these cropping cycles, or sometimes just gardens left to fallow and trees there to restore these nitrogen, and how communities and individuals were really observant about beneficial trees, and you talked about handicrafts and medicine and all of that. So maybe now we can kind of transition to kind of what have been some of the pressures that have disrupted these agroforestry, or in general these forest systems across the regions, and how has these disruptions kind of affected food security and things like resilience for Pacific communities?
I just like, before we go on to that, Kyle, I'd just like to make one point about the Polynesians, that everyone's amazed at their ability, their navigational skills to move across the Pacific and colonize areas, especially in Hawaii and across to the Marquesas and so on. But they were also brilliant horticulturists. So they had worked out that, for example, in the Marquesas, that is a perfect area for breadfruit. So they went back across the Pacific and looked for the best breadfruits and brought them back. So you have all that, not from Samoa, but they brought that back directly from Solomon Islands, Polynesia outlier, that area. But also they worked out that the fehi banana was the perfect crop, the perfect staple crop. This is the banana that has the upright bunches. That's the perfect crop for Tahiti, where it's wetter and things like that. So they went right back across the Solomons and brought these things back thousands of kilometers. selected them, and brought them back. So they're not only brilliant navigators, but brilliant horticulturists, knowing what would grow where. Yeah. So
that's cool. Yeah, that's a great picture. To know that people didn't just land and then think, but they were able to move back and forth and maintain this history and this recollection of what crops grew where and how useful and beneficial. Like you said, brilliant horticulturists.
And they brought the diversity with them. So then they had that diversity there, and they could select among it and select the ones that were even better or had particular uses. Now, you mentioned the question was about, to go back, the question was on what are the things that have impacted on traditional agroforestry. Obviously,
how has it changed? Yeah, what have been the pressures?
I think one of the pressures is obviously population growth. Like there was a period where it probably decreased due to the introduction of diseases, human diseases. But I think weeds have been a really bad thing for the Pacific. Like if you look at the old photos, for example, around places like Wanabakasi in Fiji, you just see these landscapes that are just beautifully kept. And that's because in those early days, like I'm talking about the 1940s, 50s, there weren't all those weed species that we've got today. So people could very easily look after it. Now you've got this huge number of species coming in. Some of them are really very flammable grasses. So if you look at the west of Fiji now, we're having much more frequent fires and much more, higher flammability and damage that way. So that's an issue. Is I think the weeds. We've talked about the African tulip tree before the start of the interview. The African tulip tree, or that has made agriculture very difficult. I had a colleague who said, in Fiji, people are worried about the Fijians are worried about the Indians chasing them off the land. Don't worry about the Indians, worry about the African tulip tree. Because once that gets going, that's a huge amount of work to cut it and get rid of it. We don't have proper biological controls through it. If you cut it and drop it on the ground, it just seems to grow. It's coppices. So that the African tulip trees are a really major weed. We've got other weeds like Lucina, for example, in the drier zones of Vanuatu. But some of these trees are a mixed blessing. Like we have, for example, the rain tree, Salmonia salmon. Well, that one has a very useful purpose in terms of being able to improve the soil fertility. It's nitrogen fixing, and it can also, you see them there festooned with orchids and ferns, and it's very good for biodiversity. It changes the microclimate along rivers and creeks. So even though it's an invasive exotic species, it's not all bad. The other things that have happened, I think, commercial cropping. In places like Tonga, you have cycles of commercial cropping. There'll be a big demand for bananas, so they'll clear everything to grow bananas, and then they'll clear everything to grow taro, and so the landscapes are gradually losing all the trees in them. And the trees are very important for, as we mentioned before, cycling nutrients from depth they've got below the crop root zone, or in the case of nitrogen fixing trees, adding nitrogen, but also organic matter, because the amount of organic matter that you can have in a soil is dependent on the amount of nitrogen that's there. So commercial crops have had a negative impact. Livestock has also had impacts that some of them can be positive. If you use livestock in the right way, they're an important component of an agroforestry system. But example is whitewood in Vanuatu. Whitewood is a really valuable tree for commercial timber production, export to Japan. But you can be growing it there with cattle, and then suddenly one cow will decide it wants to eat the bark. Maybe it's not getting enough fiber and it's died or something. And almost overnight, the cattle will just ring bark the whole plantation, kill your whole plantation. So the same with goats. There are situations where goats could be really useful, but goats can also be incredibly destructive in an agroforestry system. I wanted to use geese in Fiji because I think geese would be the ideal thing, but I had to travel all over Fiji. I got to they said they're over on Tabayuni. You can get them from Tabayuni. So I went over to Tabayuni and the Garden Island. And they said, oh, the last time we saw geese was 5 years ago, the week before Christmas. they hate their geese, but geese are really good in the sense that they graze the grass and the weeds and things, but don't eat your trees. They're also very good for protection. You know, like I wanted to buy some in Fiji, and they wanted to sell them for $500 each, and they're saying these are better guard dogs than a Doberman. I thought, okay, I'm not going to pay $500 for a goose. Chemical fertilizers are also, I think, an issue that previously people and still in parts of, for example, Vanuatu, they rely on their traditional agroforestry and cycle of nutrients through trees, and accordingly they can get organic certification. And I think the quality of the food they're producing there is better because they've got organic systems. But chemical fertilizers also cause some problems. That issue in Taveuni, yeah.
That's a really interesting and long list, and fascinating to me, like that your kind of widespread or commercial cropping came much later. You kind of talked about things like invasives, weeds, and the pressure associated with fire, and these being some of these big threats. So Lex, I know you've worked on a lot of agroforestry, forestry-related projects across the Pacific, and this is something that's, again, gaining a lot of traction in public strategies and things. So what is kind of the current state? Are there some examples where we're doing it really well? Kind of how are farmers responding to some of these opportunities presented? What's kind of the current state of agroforestry?
Yeah, very good question. I think it varies quite a lot through, across the Pacific, so that farmers have been generally reluctant to plant trees for timber or for fuel wood. They will plant them for fruits and nuts and edibles. But a good example, one of the systems I really like is in Samoa, where they plant they call it palmuli, or it's po in Fiji, namamau in Vanuatu. So this Flugia flexuosa, they plant that around their fields, and it's a very straight, fast-growing small tree. But the remarkable thing about it is that the wood is incredibly naturally durable. So this is what I call, this is green timber. Copper, chrome, arsenic treated pine poles is not green timber. We don't want to have those awful chemicals in our environment. So I think that the Flugia provides an ideal example of a tree that grows quickly, can be included in all farming systems, and it produces a very valuable, durable pole that you can use. I think there's a huge potential export market, for example, in vineyards where you want to have organic production of wine. You don't want to be using treated pine posts. You could use Flugia. So there's an export market, but there's also a local market for building and for local fence poles and things like that. So that's a good one. I'd say the traditional systems are still working very well in many parts of the Solomon Islands and in Vanuatu, partly because they've got a lot of their native trees are also very useful. Vanuatu, for example, is remarkable in having things like sandalwood. I think sandalwood's a success story, but it's been impacted by the development of these very large plantations in northwestern Australia, which have just really flooded the market with sandalwood. So it's very hard for sandalwood producers in the Pacific to compete. That will change over time. We had the same thing happen to our company in Fiji. We were one of the first ones to start growing tea tree for tea tree oil, but we wanted to do a proof of concept. But then by the time we proved that tea tree grew really well in Fiji, that we could produce all this oil from it, there were all these plantations started to be set up in investment, and they were tax deductible investments in Australia. And so the market became flooded with tea tree oil. So we didn't go ahead with that. I think the situation is mixed. A good thing that's happening is that farmers and forestry departments now have access to good germplasm of these species, and they're aware of them. For example, malili, which is native only in Samoa and Niue, is the most resistant tree to tropical cyclones in the whole world. Like in the early 90s, Samoa got hit by these incredible Category 5 cyclones, Vel and Ophir, and the New Zealanders, together with the Samoans, had tested about 100 different tree species, not for their cyclone, they just want to test them for a whole range of properties. But this plot of malili just stood up perfectly to the cyclone. And then, so we started to work on that. It took a few years before the trees produced seed, but we started to develop new plantations. And then when they got Heta, which was another really awful cyclone, about the only damage to the young plantings of malili was when other trees fell on them. So we've got this tree now that was, when we started that work, it was on the verge of extinction in Samoa. There were only a few of them left. And now we've propagated them, the forestry department's growing, farmers have got access to that. It'd be better if we could get that tree more widely throughout the Pacific, because of its remarkable ability to withstand Category 5 cyclones. There's virtually no other tree like it. So they've got a lot of germplasm. The breadfruit, for example, the canariums, all those things that have been selected. If we could exchange them more and farmers could have more access to it, that would be great. For example, another one is in Vanuatu. They have this incredibly straight form of what they call burao, the coast hibiscus tiliaceus, now called Talipariti tiliaceum. But that hibiscus, the coast one with the yellow flower and the dark red center, that produces really a bark that is used for fiber, for making cordage, but also the clothing, the bark cloths and things like that. But it could also be used for paper making. But they've got this incredibly straight form, so you can just plant it anywhere. It just grows like a pole, looks like a fishing rod. That's an ideal one for an agroforestry system, because you can grow that hibiscus by direct branch cuttings. You can just put them straight in the ground, and then it doesn't encroach on your forest, on your cropping land. So that can be a problem if you're using, here in Western Victoria, we use these cypress pines that just can cover a huge area, and that's lost to your cropping area. But yeah, that hibiscus is great for a live fence, as an example. Yeah. So the access to really good, like the same with in Solomon Islands, they've developed really good seed sources of Flugia. In Vanuatu, we've got really good seed sources of whitewood and Terminalia catappa. So there's more opportunities to use that better genetic material.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Lex. And so at the beginning, you made a comment about Pacific Islanders being incredible horticulturalists. Yeah. So we have all of this traditional knowledge, and then which obviously you've studied and researched and been a part of for the last 40 years. But you're also trained in Western science and as a forester and as a researcher. So my question is sort of like, how do you see these two kind of like weaving or blending together? How do we kind of move forward in our agriculture, agroforestry development, and really take advantage of both this kind of traditional knowledge, but also the Western science and technology? And maybe you were kind of leading towards that when you're talking about this genetic improvement and the availability of these species, suitability. But do you have any thoughts on this concept? So this is sort of the topic of our session here.
Yeah, I think one of the points is that when farmers grow a crop, they plant a crop of cassava or they plant a crop of dalo, they expect to get a return from everything they plant. In forestry, you may have to plant a lot more and you have to thin it out. And it may be in what we call a non-commercial thinning. So if you've got your whitewood planted at a couple of meters apart, you may need to thin it down. And they don't like to cut it down. They think, I've spent all this time planting and looking after this tree. Why do I want to cut it down? If you want to get a great big fat, whitewood in a short period of time, you have to thin the plantation out. So where genetics can come and help is that if you have a better quality of tree that you're sure is going to be a really nice big straight tree, you can plant them at much wider spacings. The Probably the best agroforestry system I've seen in the Pacific is one that was developed by a guy called Chief Harry Booley from Santo, and he planted whitewood at a very wide spacing, 10 meters by 5 meters. He had flugia in between the whitewood. So after 3 years or 8 years, you could cut out the flugia, you get your durable pole, and in between had a very wide row, like 10 meters wide. So it took a long time for the trees to start shading out those crops. So he grew pineapples and cassava and all sorts of things. Then later on, when it started to get a bit more shady, he grew the what we call the Dalanitana in Fiji, not the colocasia, anyway. And then later on, another forester came in and started to grow the songa, the metroxylon or the sago palm there, which is a very valuable crop for making thatch and things like that. So that was a really nice system, but that relied on having out of luck, I think he had a very good source of whitewood. We collected whitewood throughout Vanuatu, not the Torres Banks. We couldn't get up there because that year it was flooded, but we grew them in trials on Santo, and we found that area around East Coast Santo had the best genetic material of whitewood. So how I got involved in the Pacific was we were working with Australian trees in CSIRO, and if you travel the world, you'll see a lot of eucalypts, acacias, casuarinas, grevillea, all those. And that was partly a result of the work of CSIRO, going and doing range-wide collections and finding the best genetic material. And then people knew that when they plant that provenance, and that species, they're going to get a good result. So what we wanted to do in the Pacific was to do that the same for the local species, to do range-wide seed collections of them, grow them in a common environment and see how they perform. And you can get often a 30 or even 50% improvement just by selecting the right sort of seed source. And then if you go into breeding, then you can increase that again and maybe have things that are growing 100% more. Or if it was Donald Trump, you can have them growing 500% more. They can grow 100%, more through breeding and selection. So that's where modern science can help with traditional forestry. So often the Pacific Islanders know that the trees that they want to grow, we wanted to use the local trees because that's important from a biodiversity point of view, but also it's important that they can the people know those trees. They know what they're going to get from growing it, rather than some exotic or introduced tree. But yeah, I mean, in sometimes Pacific Islanders having there was a guy called Basil Gua. He's still there. He was the Commissioner of Conservative Forests in Solomon Islands. He travelled the length and breadth of Solomon Islands collecting teak, finding the best teak trees and growing out. And he's developed this incredible variety of teak, and now it's been taken by the Malaysians, and they're tissue culturing and exporting it all over the world. But Solomon's didn't benefit, but Solomon's has got this fantastic resource of teak, for example.
I've heard you speak a lot, and I often see you use these two slides here, where you talk about the status quo, which is the status quo of our forest, agroforestry planting, and you describe it as having very low carbon stocks, low biodiversity, frequent burning, soil erosion, downstream flooded, and just in general, these wasted economic opportunities. But then I see you kind of present an alternative option, and this is this reforested landscape where we have biodiversity and carbon stocks enhanced, soil is protected, flooding is reduced, employment and export industries. Can you share a little bit more about this vision as we kind of try to picture what's the hope for the Pacific and the bringing trees and cropping farming systems together?
Well, I think this one is really appropriate for some of the larger islands, like in Fiji or even Solomon Islands. So you can see there in this image is from Brazil. So they're growing, in this situation, they're growing eucalypts in plantation, but they've also protected and enhanced their local vegetation. So there's opportunities there. For example, in Western Viti Levu, you could use trees like that acacia mangium that I mentioned. You could grow them; they'd be the big growers, and they would act as what the acacia can do is it can suppress the flammable grasses. So you could completely stop your fires going through these large areas, and then that would be the main source of income and employment is through that planted area. But the other areas that you're protecting, they could be buffer zones along creeks and so on, they're providing a whole lot of other benefits, which are often traditional medicines are incredibly important. And many of these tree species, even many of the ones that we think of as timber trees, they also have a traditional medicinal value. And they're also important for production of cultural materials. They're important for production of food. Like often, people like going hunting pigeons and things like that in Fiji or Tonga. They can produce a whole lot of forest food, a whole lot of fruits and nuts can come from that. So there's that opportunity to do it, especially places like Fiji. You've got large areas that are just in Western Viti Levu or in parts of Banner Levu. They're just burning almost every year now, and they're not very useful. The environment's degrading. So yeah, there's that opportunity to do it. But
fantastic. Well, Lex, I think we're almost out of time, but do you have any final thoughts or messages as we kind of think about this concept and encourage the use of more trees in our food systems across the Pacific?
Yeah, I think the important thing is for people to be observant and learn from what they've got in their own environment. Like, for example, up on Rotuma, there's a very nice system where they're growing breadfruit and they grow different root crops around it. So they might have yams growing up into the canopy of the breadfruit. Underneath, close to the tree, you may have one sort of dalo, and further out from the tree, you may have a different type of dalo or sweet potato. So there's lots of opportunities to have very complex systems. I think people should look really at, rather than sort of walking, and this is how they're growing kava, walking for half a day to find an area and grow the kava. If you improve your soil near your village, you can grow better kava and on a shorter rotation. People like John Bennett have shown that in Hawaii. So there's that opportunity to grow kava or grow vegetable crops nearby by composting and using all that organic matter. You should go out to the forest, get the organic matter, bring it back to near where your village is, and have a really build up your soil and have your crops nearby, and focus more on a range of vegetables for nutrition. The problem in the Pacific is, I think it was explained very well there was a visit by the Director General of FAO, and he went to Tonga, and I think it was Tonga, and like everywhere he went, they were having these big feasts. He started to talk about 2,000 calories a day, how it was really important to get that. And in the end, the FAO advisor with him said, stop talking about that. The main problem in the Pacific is overnutrition, not undernutrition. So we need nutritional balance, and that comes from growing a wider range of vegetable crops. I remember one of the groups in Fiji was encouraging people to go to the supermarket and buy your coloured vegetables. But there weren't any coloured vegetables in the market. There was no carrots or anything. But a lot of these species do have varieties that do have, like even the sweet potato, for example, you've got that. But even some of the varieties of dalo, you've got purple sorts of dalo. Like they've got a famous one up in Rotuma, which they use for making the feki, which is really full of purple. So those things are really important. But also the trees are very important for getting a whole range of micronutrients and fiber and vitamins in your diet. So I'd encourage more complexity in the way they're growing things. Grow things closer to your village. Incorporate animals, pigs and chickens and geese into those systems. And you're you're going to have a really good, you're going to have a really nice farm with agroforest, and it's much better to work in. Like I mean, our guys, when we were working out there in along the Rewa River, they've been used to working in fields that were just baking hot in the sun, and then when we had the trees in that system, they said it's just so much more pleasant. You can go out in the middle of the day and you can do your cropping. That you've got this canopy there that's cooling things off and changing the microclimate. So yeah, the Fijians really got into it, and they found that things like cassava, for example, if you're growing cassava fully out in the open, it has a very short lifespan in the ground before it starts to go woody and fibrous in the middle. They found that when you're growing together with trees like the acacia, you can leave them there for 6 months longer, and they're still there. You don't need to harvest them and use them straight away. They keep much forest environment. So there's lots of little things anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a great picture. And instead of keep going further and farther up into the forest, you bring the organic material in the form of trees closer by to the villages and the food gardens, enhance that soil, and hopefully leave some of our forests to regrow and continue to provide these important services.
Yeah, well, even the thing like there's a lot of talking about the utility of biochar, which is basically charcoal, but we were making biochar on a large scale. We had a cut down cement mixer in Fiji and doing it that way with the acacia, making really great biochar, and the growth rates we got from our fruit trees and from our sandalwood was double through the use of biochar. So you could be doing that. If you look on the web, there were a few YouTube videos that show you how you can make biochar in the open, just very open, so people can make charcoal. It's really good to make it from bamboo too. You can just do that in the open or in a pit. You don't need very complex technology to do it. And you put that biochar, sometimes it takes a year or two to really benefit and show up. But if you put the biochar in with the organic matter and a few nitrogen, your system, you'll turbocharge your food production system. Yeah. Anyway.
Awesome. Great. That's what we want. Turbocharged food systems. Well, thank you so much, Lex. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, continuing to explore the past and see how it can influence our future. So all the best in your future work. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kyle. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Yeah. Good day.